It's shocking that many of these governments maintain that since we're dealing with a Latin American country, it's important that they remain neutral. Maria Corina Machado said in Lima a few weeks ago that in certain cases being neutral is being complicit, and actually in this case, with what's happening in Venezuela, being neutral is being complicit. You cannot be neutral when facing the bubonic plague. You cannot be neutral when you're facing a plague that, if it manages to totally control Venezuela, it's not going to remain there. It's going to keep expanding throughout our continent because, unfortunately, this utopian statist collectivism has this messianic vocation to expand and control everything. We've seen it in the first years of Commander Chavez, how Venezuela made huge efforts to expand the revolution, the Bolivarian revolution, and they have managed, in fact, to install in several Latin American societies certain tentacles that conspire against the democratic effort, which is a reality nowadays in Latin America. And it's a reality represented not only by parties traditionally democratic, but also in cases like Uruguay and Chile, with left-wing parties that have finally accepted the road of development, the structure of development, a political democracy with a market economy. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of Latin Americans that see what's happening in Venezuela with huge admiration. They feel a solidarity with this struggle, this fight of Venezuelans for freedom, because they know this Venezuelan fight is not only for the freedom of Venezuela, but also for the freedom of Latin America as a whole. The leaders of the Venezuelan resistance, young Venezuelan students that keep resisting, they are the true descendants of those Venezuelans that 200 years ago, from that small country that Venezuela was then, a small and poor country, they crossed the borders and expanded all throughout Latin America to take to Colombia, Peru, the new Ecuador, and Bolivia, the independence and freedom. I believe that that's the Venezuelan tradition, the deepest Venezuelan tradition, the most ingrained tradition, and they pretended to destroy that in the last 15 years. They have not achieved that, they will not achieve it, and the movement of these days, just like the movement that 200 years ago brought freedom to Latin America, it's going to give Venezuela that freedom back. That freedom that 15 years ago started to deteriorate. I hope the tragic experience of these last years is instructive and turns out to be good, to strengthen deeply those ideas, the ideas of modernity, progress, human rights, and the critical spirit and freedom. Those ideas that make up the democratic culture, the culture that has reduced social injustices, that has reduced exploitation, that has reduced those abuses, that has reduced the excess always represented by the power everywhere. It has not been reduced completely. That fight is never going to be over, but countries that have progressed more are the countries that have adopted the idea of freedom we liberals have as something indivisible, as something that has to be projected, put forth at the same time in the social arena, the political arena, the economical arena, the cultural arena, and the individual arena. Those are the ideas that the most advanced countries have adopted to become what they are today, and those are ideas that fortunately recently are also growing in Latin America. It's true that many things are not in good shape in Latin America, but when looking at Latin America, we should not compare it with an unreachable ideal, but with what Latin America was 10, 15, 20 years ago. If we make that comparison with the past, progress is clear. Nowadays, we have much less dictatorships than in the past, and the populist governments that unfortunately still exist in our continent, those are the minority compared to the rest. And regarding the rest, in some cases with enthusiasm and sometimes with mere resignation, the ideas of democracy, political freedom, economical freedom, they begin to grow, and that's why progress begins to arrive to Latin America. Nothing is more important for Latin America than having Venezuela added to this current of progress modernization based on the philosophy of freedom. In these recent days, when Venezuela is fighting so courageously for its own freedom and the freedom of Latin America, all Latin Americans, all of us that we believe in this model for development, we have to express our Venezuelan friends, our utmost solidarity, and the wish that this fight continues, succeeds, and gives back to Venezuela what should have always been its destiny of a country at the head of Latin America, thanks to its extraordinary potentials, and a country that, along its modern history, was a symbol of freedom. Thank you very much.